Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome once again to Ancient Epics, the place where the greatest stories of humanity come back to life. Long before marble temples rose in the Mediterranean, before pyramids pierced the Egyptian sky, and before the epics of kings were carved into stone, a vast and disciplined civilization flourished in silence. Along the river plains of South Asia, its cities were laid out with mathematical precision. Its streets ran straight as measured lines. Its people bathed in engineered water systems unknown to most of the ancient world. And yet, this civilization left behind no royal boasts, no epic chronicles of conquest, and no clear explanation for its sudden disappearance. The collapse of the Indus Civilization remains one of history's most haunting mysteries, a vanishing act written not in words, but in abandoned streets and empty homes. At its height, this civilization covered more land than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Its cities held tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, living in apparent order and relative peace. No grand palaces dominate the ruins. No towering monuments proclaim divine kings. Instead, archaeologists found uniform brick sizes, sophisticated drainage, standardized weights, and seals bearing symbols still undeciphered. Then, around 4,000 years ago, something profound changed. The cities thinned. The streets fell quiet. Trade routes dissolved. The great baths dried. By 1300 BCE, the civilization had faded into memory, leaving behind only earth-covered ruins and unanswered questions. Was the end brought by fire from the sky, by rivers that betrayed their people, or by slow, merciless shifts in climate? Was it sudden, or did it unfold across generations like a long twilight? The story of the Indus collapse is not one of a single catastrophe, but of a fragile balance between humanity and nature tested beyond its limits. Along the fertile plains of the Indus and its sister rivers, life once moved in rhythm with water and season. The land that nurtured this civilization stretched from the foothills of the Himalayas to the Arabian Sea. Rivers such as the Indus, Ravi, Beas, and the now-lost Ghaggar-Hakra system carved pathways of life through otherwise harsh terrain. Annual floods replenished the soil, allowing agriculture to thrive. Wheat, barley, dates, and cotton grew in abundance, sustaining dense urban populations. The Indus people mastered brick-making, firing clay into uniform blocks that still hold their shape after millennia beneath the soil. Cities like Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Dhalavira, and Lhasa reveal a world governed by planning rather than spectacle. Streets intersected at right angles. Houses opened inward toward courtyards, suggesting a culture valuing privacy and domestic order. Beneath the streets ran covered drains, carefully sloped to carry waste away from living spaces. Wells dotted the urban landscape, granting access to clean water for both elite and common households. In Mohenjo-daro, the Great Bath stood as a monumental structure, lined with bitumen to prevent leakage, hinting at ritual practices centered on purification and water. Trade connected these cities to distant lands. Seals bearing animal motifs, bulls, unicorn-like creatures, and elephants have been found as far away as Mesopotamia. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, copper from Rajasthan, shells from the coast, and precious stones from Iran moved along carefully maintained routes. Dockyards at Lothal suggest maritime trade across the Arabian Sea, linking the Indus world to Oman and beyond. Weights and measures remain standardized across vast distances, reflecting shared authority or deeply ingrained cultural norms. Yet beneath this appearance of permanence lay a delicate dependence on natural cycles. The Indus civilization rose during a period of relatively stable climate when monsoon rains arrived predictably and rivers followed familiar paths. Modern geological studies reveal that these rivers were not eternal. The Ghaggar-Hakra, once a mighty waterway feeding numerous settlements, began to weaken as tectonic shifts altered its course. Satellite imagery and sediment analysis suggest that by the mid-3rd millennium BCE, this river was already drying in stages, turning once productive lands into marginal fields. Climate records extracted from cave deposits, lake sediments, and marine cores tell a parallel story. Around 2200 BCE, a significant weakening of the Indian summer monsoon occurred. Rainfall became less reliable. Floods that once nourished crops either failed to arrive or came with destructive irregularity. Agricultural yields declined, placing strain on food storage systems that had supported urban life. Wells ran deeper, but water tables fell. The careful balance between settlement and sustenance began to fray. Archaeological layers reveal subtle signs of stress rather than sudden annihilation. In later phases, brick quality declines. Urban planning becomes less rigid. Large public structures fall into disuse. Some neighborhoods show signs of overcrowding, while others stand abandoned. Trade seals become rarer, and long-distance exchange diminishes. Instead of abrupt destruction, evidence points toward gradual decentralization, as people began leaving cities for smaller villages closer to remaining water sources. No widespread evidence of violent invasion marks this transition. Skeletons do not bear the scars of mass slaughter. Burn layers are limited and localized. The old theories of conquering armies sweeping down from the north have long since faded under closer scrutiny. What remains is a quieter, more sobering narrative. A civilization adapting, retreating, and transforming under environmental pressure. Astronomy may also hold fragments of this story. The Indus people tracked celestial movements with care, aligning structures and settlements with cardinal directions. Seasonal cycles were essential to agricultural planning, and the sky served as a calendar. As monsoon patterns shifted, the once reliable relationship between stars, seasons, and harvests may have broken down. Ritual timings lost their anchor. The heavens, once a guide, became less predictable, mirroring the uncertainty on the ground. Even as cities emptied, the people did not vanish entirely. Cultural elements persisted, flowing into later traditions across the subcontinent. Pottery styles evolved rather than disappeared. Agricultural practices adapted to new conditions. The descendants of the Indus carried fragments of their world forward, though the urban grandeur faded into memory. By the end of this first chapter, the great city stood largely silent. Streets that once echoed with daily life lay buried beneath drifting sands and river silt. Wells filled with debris. The great bath stood dry, its purpose forgotten. What remained was not a tale of sudden doom, but of slow withdrawal, a civilization shaped by water, undone by its absence, and preserved only through the traces it left behind. In the next part, the deeper forces behind this transformation will emerge. As the long twilight of the Indus world unfolds across generations and landscapes. As the great cities of the Indus world entered their long twilight, the transformation did not unfold as a single dramatic moment, but as a slow reshaping of life across generations. The collapse was not an ending carved in fire and ash, but a gradual unraveling woven quietly into soil, water, and memory. Archaeology reveals this phase as a time of movement rather than annihilation, when people responded to shifting realities with adaptation rather than despair. Across the plains once dominated by Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, urban density thinned. Streets that had been maintained with precision were no longer repaired with the same care. Brick sizes, once standardized across thousands of kilometers, began to vary. This subtle change speaks of weakening centralized authority, or perhaps the absence of the shared systems that had once bound a civilization together. The great civic order did not collapse overnight. It loosened its grip slowly, like hands releasing sand. The rivers, which had once been generous and predictable, now demanded new strategies. Geological studies suggest that the Indus itself remained active, but its flooding patterns changed. Some floods grew more erratic, damaging fields instead of nourishing them. Other seasons passed with insufficient water, shrinking harvests, and testing food reserves. Communities that had depended on surplus grain stored in urban centers now faced uncertainty. As storage systems failed to meet demand, populations dispersed toward smaller, more sustainable settlements. The drying of the Ghaggar-Hakra river system had particularly far-reaching consequences. Along its banks had risen hundreds of towns and villages, many of them deeply integrated into trade and agricultural networks. As the river weakened, these settlements became increasingly isolated. Fields turned arid. Wells sank deeper into the earth. Eventually, many communities abandoned these lands altogether, migrating eastward toward regions where monsoon-fed rivers still flowed. This movement did not resemble a chaotic flight, but a measured relocation. Archaeological layers show continuity in pottery techniques, tool-making, and domestic rituals. People carried their knowledge with them, reshaping it to suit new environments. Urban life gave way to rural patterns where smaller communities relied more directly on local resources. Craft production became less specialized, suggesting that households now produced what cities had once centralized. Trade networks, once the lifeblood of the Indus world, gradually dissolved. The seals that had authenticated goods and agreements became scarce. Distant connections with Mesopotamia faded as maritime trade declined. Dockyards silted up, and ships no longer arrived with copper, shells, or precious stones. Without these exchanges, the economic foundation of large cities weakened further. The Indus Civilization, once outward-facing and interconnected, turned inward, focusing on survival rather than expansion. Religious and ritual life also evolved during this period. The great public spaces, such as the bath complexes and assembly areas, fell into disuse. This suggests a shift away from centralized communal rituals toward more localized or household-based practices. Figurines, amulets, and symbols continued to appear, but their distribution changed. Spiritual life did not disappear. It adapted, reflecting smaller social units and changing priorities. Some scholars point to evidence of increasing aridity across the broader region, part of a global climatic event that affected civilizations from the Mediterranean to East Asia around 2200 BCE. Known through ice cores and sediment records, this period brought droughts, cooling temperatures, and unstable weather patterns. In Mesopotamia, cities collapsed under similar pressures. In Egypt, centralized power weakened. The Indus world was not isolated from these forces. It was part of a larger human story shaped by climate. Yet the Indus response differed in character. There is little evidence of famine on a catastrophic scale, and no mass graves tell of sudden death. Instead, the population appears to have spread out, reducing pressure on fragile ecosystems. This dispersal may have allowed many to survive conditions that would have destroyed a more rigid society. The very absence of grand palaces and rigid hierarchies may have made adaptation possible. Astronomical knowledge, once critical for agricultural timing, may have become less reliable as climate patterns shifted. The stars still moved with eternal precision, but their relationship to rainfall and seasons grew uncertain. Ritual calendars based on celestial cycles lost their practical alignment with the land. This disconnect between sky and soil would have carried deep cultural implications, challenging long-held assumptions about cosmic order. As centuries passed, the memory of great cities faded into stories and fragments. Bricks from abandoned structures were reused in new villages. Streets were swallowed by sediment. Children grew up unaware that beneath their fields lay the remains of carefully planned urban worlds. The Indus script, once stamped onto seals and tablets, fell out of use. Without writing, history became oral, fluid, and vulnerable to forgetting. Yet disappearance does not mean erasure. Linguistic studies suggest that agricultural terms, place names, and cultural practices from the Indus world may have flowed into later traditions across the subcontinent. The legacy of cotton cultivation, water management techniques, and town planning echoes faintly in subsequent cultures. The Indus Civilization transformed rather than vanished, dissolving into the wider human tapestry. By the end of this long transition, the great urban age of the Indus had passed. What remained was a landscape dotted with villages instead of cities, fields shaped by caution rather than abundance, and people whose lives were quieter but resilient. The collapse was complete, yet life endured, reshaped by necessity and memory. In the final part, the deeper meaning of this collapse will be revealed, not merely as an ancient tragedy, but as a timeless lesson about balance, adaptation, and the fragile bonds between humanity and the natural world. As the last urban lights of the Indus world dimmed, the land itself became the final keeper of memory. Wind carried dust across abandoned streets. Rivers shifted their courses without regard for former boundaries. Over centuries, layers of silt and sand sealed homes, wells, and workshops beneath the earth, preserving them in silence. What had once been among humanity's greatest experiments in urban living became a buried echo, waiting for patient hands to uncover its meaning. Millennia later, when archaeologists first uncovered the bricks of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, the absence of spectacle was striking. There were no colossal statues of kings, no victory stelae, no inscriptions boasting of divine rule. Instead, there were drains, wells, granaries, and modest homes, evidence of a society that invested not in glorifying rulers, but in sustaining daily life. This quiet dignity makes the collapse of the Indus civilization especially poignant. Its end was not marked by conquest or tyranny, but by forces beyond human command. Modern science continues to refine the understanding of those forces. High-resolution climate models, combined with sediment analysis from the Arabian Sea, confirm a prolonged weakening of the monsoon system beginning in the late 3rd millennium BCE. This was not a brief drought, but a long-term shift toward drier conditions. Such a change would have gradually undermined flood-based agriculture, especially in regions dependent on seasonal overflow rather than perennial rivers. The Indus system, so perfectly adapted to stability, found itself strained by unpredictability. Tectonic movements also played a quiet but decisive role. The Indian subcontinent rests on a restless geological foundation, slowly colliding with the Eurasian plate. This motion altered river gradients and redirected watercourses over time. The Gagar-Hakra, once sustained by Himalayan glacial melt, lost its sources as rivers were captured by other basins. Settlements that had relied on this lifeline faced inevitable decline. No ritual or technology could command a river to return. The story of the Indus collapse therefore unfolds not as a moral failure, but as a lesson in limits. The civilization achieved extraordinary harmony between engineering, environment, and society, yet that harmony depended on conditions that did not last forever. When the balance shifted, adaptation took precedence over resistance. People moved. Lifestyles changed. Urban ambition yielded to rural resilience. In this light, the Indus civilization did not truly die. It transformed. Genetic studies indicate continuity between ancient populations of the Indus region and later inhabitants of South Asia. Cultural threads, agricultural knowledge, craft traditions, and settlement patterns persisted and evolved. The legacy of standardized bricks and careful water management influenced later town planning, even as the memory of great cities faded. The undeciphered script remains one of the most haunting remnants of this world. Stamped onto seals and tablets, its symbols suggest administration, trade, and perhaps ritual meaning. Without a bilingual inscription, its voice remains silent. Yet even in silence, it speaks volumes. It reminds humanity that not all greatness announces itself loudly, and not all wisdom survives in written words. The collapse of the Indus Civilization also reshapes how ancient history is understood. It challenges the idea that civilizations fall only through war or decadence. It reveals how deeply human societies are woven into climatic and geological systems. It shows that complexity can dissolve peacefully, leaving behind continuity rather than chaos. In an age that often equates collapse with catastrophe, the Indus offers a subtler narrative. As centuries turned into millennia, legends arose across the subcontinent, stories of lost rivers, vanished cities, and golden ages remembered dimly. Though not direct records, these traditions may carry distant echoes of environmental change and migration. Memories survive not as history, but as myth, reshaped by time and retelling. Today, the ruins stand beneath open skies, their baked bricks warmed by the same sun that once shone upon bustling streets. Tourists walk where merchants once traded. Scholars trace walls where families once gathered. The silence is profound, yet not empty. It carries the weight of human endeavor, resilience, and humility before nature. The collapse of the Indus civilization ultimately stands as one of humanity's most important stories, not because of how it ended, but because of how it endured. It teaches that survival does not always mean preservation of form, but preservation of life and knowledge through change. It reminds the world that even the most advanced societies remain guests upon the land, subject to forces older and greater than themselves. In the glow of this ancient firelight, the Indus story closes not with ruin, but with continuity. The cities fell, but the people did not vanish. The rivers changed, but life found new paths. And beneath layers of earth, the silent cities waited, holding their lessons for a future that would one day seek them again. If these ancient voices touched your heart today, please consider subscribing to Ancient Epics and ringing the bell so you never miss the next forgotten tale. Thanks for watching.